Do you also find it difficult to build up a meaningful relationship with your grandchildren at a distance? As a long-distance aunt to a 2-year-old in Australia, I wanted to create solutions for the millions of family members who cannot be physically together all the time. This is why I created Peekabond, an app that helps you to connect with young children at a distance. The app works with the following 3 steps. First, we give playful activities suggestions that are based on your child's development stage. These suggestions are science-based and gamified. Secondly, you can create a private family circle. And finally, we'll let you send videos back and forth so you don't have to be live at the same time, and save them in one spot for your grandchild to watch. We've got over 120 content suggestions. You can build a love bank for your grandchildren. And if you go to the Cool Grandpa website and look for the affiliate links, sign up for a newsletter with a lot of inspiring content, or you can try the app for free.
Welcome back. I'm excited for you to join me for this week's conversation. Now, a couple of things before we get started. If you have not liked and subscribed to the podcast on your favorite podcast hosting platform, please go in and do that. Also, do me a favor and share this episode with a friend who might really enjoy hearing some of the data, some of the science, let's say, between intergenerational relationships and why grandparents are so important. The next thing I want to ask you is, if you're part of an organization that's looking for speakers in the spring or summer of next year, do me a favor. See if I would be a good fit for your organization. And if so, I would love to talk to your event organizer and see how I can best serve your organizations. I'd love to come out and talk to you and present some of the interesting subjects and topics that I've come across with this Cool Grandpa podcast. Before we get into this, I do want to let you know we had a couple of dog noises in the background, and we're a dog-friendly podcast, so not a big deal there. But you're also going to hear me being a little bit more raspy than normal. When I was recording this, I did have a bit of a cold, so it was definitely something that comes across in the recording. Apologies for some coughing, some sniffling. So what I want to do now is introduce you to my favorite new doctor. We are talking with Dr. Abby Stephan. Now, I met Abby through the Long Distance Grandparent Society because she had been a guest over at that awesome group. So I wanted to learn more about her research and learn more about what the research says about intergenerational relationships. Dr. Abby Stephan has recently gotten her PhD from Clemson University and is focused primarily on intergenerational relationships within informal learning contexts, including the family and community. More specifically, her work examines the bond between non-adjacent generations within a family, or put it another way, grandparents and the grandchildren. So Abby's got some really great research, some great stories about her experience growing up in a multi-generational household, and then how that really kind of prompted her to go down this path of researching these intergenerational relationships. You know, it's great because so many of us sit here and we go, hey, these relationships are important, but we don't really have any data or any way to go, why are they really important? Other than we just kind of instinctually know these intergenerational relationships can be very beneficial for both the grandparents and the grandkids. So enough talking. Without further ado, let's jump into this conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Abby, welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm so excited to have you on here. You may be close to one of the youngest guests that I've had. And this is exciting for me because the topic is this multi-generational research that you've done as part of your PhD study. So please welcome to the Cool Grandpa podcast. And I'm excited to, like I said, have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to represent the younger end of the spectrum, because it really is an age continuum that makes up society, that makes up families especially. So I'm excited to be joining you today.
One of the things that I wanted to dive into a little bit is as we get into how you developed an interest in this line of research, is what was your relationship and what is your relationship like with your grandparents? And did that spawn you to go into this field of research?
It absolutely did. So I definitely had a closer relationship to my paternal grandparents growing up. For the first 4 years of my life, my mom was going back to school, back to nursing school. And so we moved in with my paternal grandparents. And so I had a really close relationship with them. And during that time, in the last 2 years that we were living with them, my grandfather's mother actually moved in with us as well. So we were in like a double-decker, multi-generational household with all of the generations at once. So it was 5 adults and me. Surely that did not end up in me becoming spoiled in any way. But that was my experience with my paternal grandparents. And then when we moved out, we moved into our own house with just my mom and dad, and at that point, my younger sister. We lived 5 minutes down the road. So we were still able to have a really close relationship. My grandmother would pick me up from school. We would go over there in the afternoons. And so we continued to be close until my family moved when I was in high school. And we still were able to keep up a strong relationship, I think in part because we had that really solid foundation, but also because of things like modern technology. We were able to talk often. We prioritized trips to see each other. And so that continued to be a really important and fruitful relationship of mine from early childhood to middle childhood to adolescence and even today. I still keep in touch with them often. We talk on a bi-weekly basis or so. And I'm 8 hours away driving distance from them, but I still try to get up there often throughout the year. They're in their 80s. And so it's an important relationship for me, but also I want to make sure that they're connected to what's happening in my life, and that we have that bi-directional interaction. And then on my maternal side, my mom is the second youngest of 7 siblings. So I definitely have older grandparents in that sense. Unfortunately, I didn't get to know my maternal grandmother. She passed away just a month or so after I was born. But my mother's father came and lived with us after we moved out of living with my paternal grandparents. And so there's all sorts of fun lineage things happening. This is really where it's nice to have like a chart or a diagram to point to. But he came in and lived with us locally. And so we had a close relationship until he passed away as well when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And so I really enjoyed getting to know my grandparents and still continuing to have a relationship with them. It helped to ground me in what it means to be part of a family and what it means to carry on a legacy, or to make changes as you see fit within that family legacy. If there's something that was happening in past generations of a family that you want to establish a new norm or a new precedent, how to do that gracefully and in a way that really benefits everyone involved. So that's just my relationships with my grandparents in a nutshell. Or maybe that was long-winded. It depends on how you look at it.
No, that was great. I enjoyed hearing about that. Do you remember any particular activities or, I don't know, lack of a better word, maybe connection points that your grandparents had with you that was like, oh, this is our thing to go do?
Yeah, so I think my grandfather, my grandmother had retired by the time that we were living with them. She worked part-time for most of her life, and my grandfather was in the Navy. And so he was still working in the Navy. and retired around that time, but kept working in an adjacent position. And so I just remember he would come home after working and I would beg him to go play in his truck. He had this blue truck, and the back of the truck, the bed of the truck had little raised seats. And so we would pretend that we were on a bus and doing all of this. And looking back now, that's really special, because knowing what it's like to work full time and come home and be exhausted and just want to chill out, the fact that he took the time to make that a fun event for me, and it became a ritual. I mean, it was something we did every day for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and it meant the world to me. And that was special to look back on. And then with my grandmother, she has the best imagination of anyone that I've ever met. And so we would do lots of creative activities together. We would make up songs, we would make up dances. Oftentimes I would write the songs, or I would sing the songs, and I would ask her to transcribe for me. So we have lots of documented transcriptions of nonsense songs and lyrics. And sometimes we'll still go through and look back at them and say, oh, do you remember when we talked about this or did that? And that was really special. Something a little bit later, when I was in my adolescence, we went on a family trip to Germany, which I realize is not something that everyone's able to do, but thankfully we were fortunate enough to do that. And my grandfather's actually from Germany. He moved to the States when he was about 7 or 8 years old. And so that was incredibly special, because we got to see where he grew up, which was during World War II. So some of the places where he was growing up didn't look the same as they did when he was a boy, just because he was right in the middle of the war. But it was neat to see where he came from, and in places that held significance to him from when he was young. And we got to do that as a whole family. And so those are really special memories as well. Definitely not typical. We weren't taking trips to Germany all the time, but that's just one really special event that we were able to do.
Well, I'm glad you had that opportunity to take that trip, because I think that ties in with some of the research that you found in terms of grandfathers and grandmothers feeling like part of their role is to pass on where the family came from, and then also support the grandchildren and where the family's going, but giving that sense of connectedness to the grandchildren.
Right. Yeah, the term that's used often in that work is roots, which I think is, I love that idea of roots, because it thinks of the family as a tree and there are different branches. But what really solidifies the tree and the family unit are the roots and the base and where you come from, which I think is important to have that perspective.
It's also been one of those things too, where talking with different adolescent psychologists and people talking about the importance of grandparents, in that giving the grandchildren a sense of grounding and a sense of where they fit. And certainly everybody has different relationships and all of that stuff, but I find it's really an interesting thing of figuring out where you fit in the scheme of things, especially probably as you start to head into 10, 11, 12, 13, those early teenage years, trying to just figure out where's my place in the world and where's that at.
Right. Identity development is huge. Sorry about my dog.
Oh, that's fine. We're pet friendly here.
He just wants to be part of the conversation. But yeah, during those ages, especially like you said, starting 10, 11, and then building into adolescence, part of the goal in that stage for children is to figure out who they are, where they fit. And so identity is a huge piece, and especially family identity, and how that then goes on to inform a personal identity is really interesting. It's also interesting, the research shows that something really instrumental in that is the idea of family stories or intergenerational narratives. And so storytelling is something that is often seen as fun, but it's actually really formative and an important thing to do in your family. So you can start thinking about how to convey different stories, whether that's about your own life, your own childhood, or more distant family members or experiences or things that are important. But often stories stick really well. And so thinking about how you can convey certain lessons through stories is a great thing to do.
And that's interesting that you said that, because in the back of my mind for the last couple of months, I've been thinking about I need to do an episode and talk to somebody about storytelling, because I think it's a lost art. Now, I came up with Boy Scouts, and I came up with sitting around campfires and Scoutmaster minutes and all these kinds of things. But I know a lot of people don't have that kind of experience about sitting around the campfire telling spooky stories, and we lose that as we get older, because you don't say, well, let's say you sit around like in your 20s, typically you're telling stories about your friends and telling about a rough night that they had or a funny situation, but you kind of lose that element of building up tension and then coming in with a surprise. But I find those attributes also really can help with that storytelling from a family perspective, about telling the story of a grandfather that may have crossed the plains or, smuggled himself on a ship out of Ireland back in the 1600s, if you're doing genealogy. That puts a little asterisk and everything next to that. Like, yeah, I need to do that. I need to go find me a good storyteller to bring on here to tell us how to build those stories up.
Yeah. And even not to dwell on storytelling, but even from a skill building perspective for both grandparents and grandchildren, having someone model how to tell a good story is really important. Just thinking about communication and the skill of being able to make cohesive statements, to be able to convey a point in a way that's persuasive, is really important as children are getting older and learning about how to have social interaction, how to communicate what they think, how they feel in the world. So I think it even goes beyond building that family identity and solidifying those kinds of notions.
Yeah, you're right, because everything's a story. And as the grandchildren in this case, I'm going to say it'll be children, grandchildren, but I remember coming up and needing to do a book summary, a book report, in sixth grade, stand in front of the class, tell us about, Frankenstein and reading that story, and having that skill set to be able to do that, to do an introduction, to have a middle, have an end, what's the purpose of the story, is really important, and something that I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something that I would also say, hey, grandparents, get those kids out there telling stories. And when they are telling a story, don't interrupt. Let them get through it, and share stories back and forth. Turn off the TVs, and go out for a walk and tell stories. So thanks.
Right. And it could be as easy as asking, what was something interesting that happened today at school? And or if they're older, something interesting that happened with this club that you're affiliated with, or this thing that you're interested in, tell me about it. And asking follow-up questions to help to craft that coherent story around that. It doesn't have to be, the be all end all story. It can be little things sprinkled in throughout the day, throughout the conversation.
Absolutely. And folks, the stories don't have to be very weighty, and they don't have to be, here's the life lesson I'm trying to get through to you. It could be as simple as, telling a story about having your little brother looking at the end of a hose while you got the other side kinked, and then you let it go and your brother got a face full of water. Hey, yeah. Make it funny and lighthearted as well. Mix it all up. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about, you've had this awesome experience with your grandfathers and grandparents. How did that start to influence you, or what took you in the direction of studying intergenerational relationships?
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in learning. And I think as I think back about why am I interested in learning, why am I interested in thinking about how we grow, how we develop throughout life, a lot of it has to do with my grandparents and the educational opportunities that that came up in my interactions with my grandparents naturally, and the things that they fostered in those relationships, like learning cursive because I thought that it looked pretty. And then we sat down and, as a 5-year-old, I was trying to do cursive. And those types of things were really impactful and important to me. At the same time, I saw that others who I knew didn't have as strong of relationships with their grandparents. Especially when I was in college, I would talk to some of my friends and they were like, I have to go see my grandma for Thanksgiving. I don't really want to go. And I was like, are you kidding me? I would love to hang out with my grandma. There's nothing else I would like to do than to be with my grandma and my grandpa. And so I saw that disconnect and I said, well, maybe their relationships weren't as special as mine for some reason. And maybe the learning that happened in their relationships wasn't as salient or as present as it was in my relationship. And so I started to really look at how I started out really broadly looking at just intergenerational relationships or relationships between individuals of different ages, how that influences the way that we learn, the way that we develop different outcomes in that sense. And then I started to get narrower and narrower as I realized that I'm really interested in this grandparent thing. I think there's something exponentially more special about it. Not that relationships between non-related older adults and young people can't also be special, but I think there's that baked in family component, which just adds an exponent to it, so to speak. And so that was really what motivated looking at grandparent-grandchild relationships and intergenerational relationships in families. It's why do these matter for some people and not for others? And how can we make these relationships as impactful as possible or create stronger relationships where we might need to bolster the relationship itself?
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. But that's the thing that jumps out to me is that's exactly what you want from like a university type setting, right? Is like, hey, I want to learn about the stars and the moon and everything in space. And then as you start learning that scope of focus becomes narrower and narrower, and you start to go deeper and deeper into those certain subjects. So, it's really interesting how that started out. And the other thing that I liked too was that there was something there where it's like, hey, wait a second, there's something in this relationship that either probably gave you more for fulfillment versus a friend of yours that didn't have that relationship. And you were able to go, hey, there's something here. What is this thing? What is this connection? Because to your point, if you look at it just as a relationship by itself, there's nothing that would say, hey, this should be more special than another relationship, right? But then you dove into it and it's like, wait, there's some underlying things here. And that was really great. And you provided a great little summary of your studies. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting with this was how close the grandfathers and grandmothers tended to trend the same way. And there's some definite differences, but by and large, it's about the same. And I was surprised about that. Were there anything else that really stood out to you? Like when I was doing research in grad school, we'd always go in with like a theory about what we expect the outcomes to be, right? Did you have something in mind where it's like, oh, grandmas are going to be way above grandfathers in, certain categories? Maybe it's relationship skills and some of that. And then your studies shocked you going the other way.
Yeah, so I think typically when we think about stereotypical grandmothers and stereotypical grandfathers, which I try not to do, but a little bit it's inevitable as you're thinking about your own experiences and the experiences of other people around you, we do tend to think of grandmothers as being more relationship oriented, of being more warm and caring, and grandfathers, sitting back in the armchair and just having the grandchildren running around, but not necessarily being as active. And obviously we know that that's a false stereotype. Otherwise the Cool Grandpa podcast wouldn't be as successful as it is if there were a bunch of grandparent or grandfathers specifically that didn't care about their relationship with their grandchildren. And so I was pleased to see that that was not the case, that there weren't a bunch of grandfathers who, passively took the survey and then moved on with their lives. The grandfathers that I had as participants, which were less than the grandmothers, there was only about 16% grandfathers. So that was expected because typically grandmothers tend to be more involved in that sense from just a survey perspective. And there are some different reasons which we can get into, but it's typical for women in general to participate more in survey research. But with those grandfathers that did respond to the survey and were providing information about their experiences with their grandchildren, they were incredibly engaged and really voiced an interest in gaining more skills in those relational aspects that they perhaps felt like they weren't quite measuring up to the grandmothers in. So things like talking about issues in their grandchildren's lives, they were interested in learning about. Things like understanding developmental stages within childhood and adolescence, and really the skills that children and adolescents need to be building in their specific age brackets. That was something that grandmothers really didn't have any interest in learning more about, but grandfathers were all about getting more information on, which I thought was really interesting. But really more of those just relational categories. You could see that the grandfathers wanted more exposure to those types of things, which I think is really promising. It shows that grandfathers want to have deep and meaningful relationships with their grandchildren, more so than they're already having at this point.
That tends to track with the grandfathers that I'm talking to. So sometimes I'm talking with older men that are in their 70s, early 80s, about their experience with being a grandfather. And then when we talk about the role models, the grandfathers that they had. So these would have been grandfathers from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. If they were still alive to be grandfathers at that point, a lot of times it felt like the conversations tended to lean towards grandmother took the role of that grandparent relationship. Grandfather was there to be kind of the leader of the family unit when they're having maybe holiday meals or gatherings or whatnot. But it was really up to grandma to know what's going on with all the grandkids. It's up to grandma to, remind grandpa about birthday cards and things like that. But as I'm talking to younger men and going into even myself, and I'm on the towards the front end of Generation X. So I was born in 1970. I think Gen X starts 68-ish. I don't remember. It all depends on who's studying classifications, right? But we're recognizing that this tail end of the boomer generation, starting of Gen X, we're going to be grandparents longer than we're going to be parents. And, with all this 50 is or 50 is the new 30 or, whatever you're saying is like, the truth is, yeah, we are more active. We've got office jobs. Not so many of us are working the fields. And now we're around more and we're trying to figure out what grandfather is. And certainly I think a lot of people are putting off the standoffish, checked out part. There's still going to be some of that, and some of that's personality driven, some of that's modeling behavior, whatever.
And some grandmothers are like that as well. A lot of it does depend on personality.
Yeah, it does. But I think we're trying to figure out this grandfather thing. And that's what's so exciting about this. And what's exciting too about the research saying, hey, grandfathers are wanting to get into the game, so to speak, and figure this out, because it's only when did they start classifying children as childhood? Was that like turn of the 20th century? Like childhood wasn't a thing until the early 20th.
You're just a small person who can help with our
Right.
labor tasks,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah, yeah. You know, they're watching their siblings or whatever. And then it became like, okay, so what's parenting? And then now it feels like, okay, we're trying to figure out and evolve into what's grandparenting. And then as another I want to say subspecies, but that's not the right word.
But yeah, a subset or
Yeah,
a drop down within that. And
yeah,
yeah, that completely tracks. There was a wave in the 1960s. I'm not sure what was happening, but there was a slight wave or a crest in grandparent research where it was really popular. And then it sort of tapered off in the 90s and early 2000s. There was a little bit more interest in grandparenting. And it's really starting to pick up again in the last 5 years or so. There's been a lot more research on grandparents. And I've seen even in the last 3 years, specific research on grandfathers, because I think a lot of the research, similar to the issue that I had with my dissertation research, is that when we say, okay, here's a study about grandparents, it's 80% grandmothers, 20% grandfathers. And so we're learning things about grandparents in general, but there's something going on with that grandfather piece that's important to isolate and understand better. And so you're absolutely right that there's an uptick in interest in grandfathering as well.
it was interesting with your research talking about grandfathers were interested in knowing the developmental parts of the kids. And to me, that was hitting in some of the other findings. To me, that's almost the analytical side of the guys trying to go, okay, I was too busy with my kids. I knew kids were going through development and everything else, but now it's like, wow, what is the right level of engagement with a 2-year-old, and what's going to be 2 to 6 years, and what's going to be these things.
Right.
So that was an interesting thing for that. And I'm wondering too if that's part of what we were talking about older men trying to figure out this grandfather thing, as far as, okay, how do I engage with the kids? Because we're now in our 50s, 60s, and so forth. And then we get these little ankle biters on our knees. And it's like, well, now I got to figure this thing out.
Right. And if you're essentially, like we talked about at the beginning, if what you're trying to do now is reshape the trend there, or the precedent for what it looks like to be a grandfather, if your grandfather was more passive, if even your father towards your children was more passive, and you're trying to become a more involved, a more hands-on grandfather, then that information could be really helpful for creating a model with which to interact with your grandchildren, essentially as a man interacting with children, adolescents. So I think there's absolutely a space for more targeted resources, even just like infographics or something basic. I mean, I think the podcast is an absolutely amazing outlet for grandfathers who are interested in learning more about how to be engaged in their role. I also understand that we're preaching to the choir a little bit here,
Yeah.
and the people who are listening are likely more hands-on, more engaged. But I think spreading the word and having accessible resources like this, like infographics or really brief brochures, just saying, here are a couple of tips, try this strategy, try this approach with your grandchild who's 2 years old or 4 years old or 6 years old, or 16 years old, because it's a little bit of a different beast at each developmental stage.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one thing I thought about too with this is a while back I had somebody on that was an expert in older men's mental health, and we were talking about depression, anxiety, loss of network and connectiveness. And did you come across any of those types of themes when you're looking at the grandparents' side or in your research? And what did you find with some of those?
Yeah, so I part of the study was looking specifically at how grandparents feel. So it was a subjective measure because it was asking grandparents, do you feel as if your grandchildren have impacted your physical wellness, your physical activity levels, your mental health, your social wellness or your ability to have connections with others, and then really broadly just health conditions. And across the board with both grandmothers and grandfathers, it was essentially a resounding yes for certain categories, like mental health. It was a higher yes. It was yes, absolutely. Whereas the other ones were more steady yeses with, of course, some variation across. But in general, it grandparents saw their grandchildren as being helpful for their health across those different areas. And that aligns really well with past research as well. Specifically, some of the big domains where we see grandchildren positively impacting their grandparents are things like social emotional development, where grandparents feel like they're able to have conversations with people from other ages, which is really powerful. You're able to say, okay, this person is, Gen Z, or they're a millennial in some cases, but yet I'm still able to have a conversation with them like a human because I have a grandchild who's a human who I can have a conversation with. And so it helps to bridge some of those generational divides outside of the family as well as within the family, which is really important, especially as we're thinking about a multi-generational workforce. I don't know about you, but in the place where I work, we have, if you're thinking about generations as far as Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, I mean, we have all four of those in our office, and we only have 12 people who work there. So it's pretty incredible, and chances are you're going to have diversity there. So if it starts in the family and you're able to build on that, then it translates to other settings as well. Another big thing, like you highlighted, is this idea of improved mental health or psychological well-being. In addition to family stories or connections with grandparents impacting grandchildren's sense of identity, it also really helps grandparents, what we found, to have a renewed sense of purpose. Or some of my participants described it as sort of like an exuberance about life. They're reminded to be spontaneous. They're reminded to enjoy the little things. And that shift in perspective with having a relationship with your grandchild can be really important, both in middle adulthood, but also in older adulthood. It helps to ground people, is what the research essentially says. And then also as far as cognitive health or brain health, which I know is really important to it should be to everyone. We're all constantly aging, but especially to those who may be in their 70s or 80s who are thinking about their brain health and maintaining cognitive health as long as they can. Interactions with grandchildren or with anyone from a younger generation has been shown to help strengthen those connections within the brain. Some specific areas that are improved are problem solving skills, but also your ability to develop new skills and build new neural connections, essentially. And so you're able to maintain, but then also continue to build upon some of the brain pathways that we know are really important to keep going. And also creativity. You're able to sort of bounce ideas off of one another. And in the instance, anecdotally with my grandma, we were creating songs together. If I said, well, I don't know what rhymes with slimy, she would say, well, what about briny? And you just start to sort of riff off of one another in hopefully a natural way. And so that really enhances your brain flow and blood flow and circulation in the brain with creativity in that sense.
Oh, I like that. And it reminds me too of talking with some of these grandfathers that are very focused on getting down and playing and having that interaction and relearning how to not be so serious all the time. I mean, most of us are kind of heading towards the twilight of our careers and work and stuff, and we've been adults and maybe empty nesters, and we're not kidding around the same way we used to when we were in our 20s or our teens. And then being able to get down on the ground and play with the kids is huge. And having the imagination and doing the tea parties with Barbie and playing Hot Wheels and doing all of these things really seems to like you said, spark a lot of energy in revitalizing people. So definitely, look for those opportunities to be imaginative with the grandkids. It's a great excuse to exercise that dormant muscle.
Mm-hmm. I would also say, so part of my research focuses on understanding grandparents' experience and how they characterize what it means to be a grandparent. And another piece specifically sampled adult grandchildren, so those in their 20s and early 30s, saying, hey, what about your relationship with your grandparents was important to you, continues to be important to you, and how is that impacting your life now? And a lot of the stories or examples that the adults provided were related to silly little things where their grandfathers specifically were playing with them. So one participant talked about how her grandpa used to get down on all fours and pretend to be a kitty cat, and they would, get spaghetti and put it on the ground, and he would eat it off the ground, and they thought that was just hilarious. And it was something that, that was when she was 5 or 6 years old, and she still remembers it 30 years later. And that's a highlight of her relationship with her grandfather. And she was able to translate it and say he was really serious. He was really renowned in his career. He was a top executive at a small company, and people respected him, but yet he was able to get down on all fours and meow like a cat. And it just meant the world to her and her brother. And so I think it showed her that there's a space for humility and for building connections and prioritizing the little things with the people that you care about. And she took all of that from that one instance of him doing something silly. And so I would say, for your listeners, don't underestimate the little things. And even if you're feeling silly, that could make a huge impact on your grandchild. So I thought that was a really neat finding from sort of complementary research to the things specifically about the grandparent experience.
I always think about some of the play and the interaction, especially with younger grandchildren, is that's when you form the bonds, and that's when a lot of development happens in the relationship that you can't really put words to. But let's say the same 5-year-old little girl that had her grandfather being a cat, when she's 15 and is having trouble with boys or girls at school or whatever the case is, they're more likely to come and talk to the grandparents. I mean, obviously the parents, we're not cutting the parents out, but at the same time, most grandchildren, if they have a close relationship with grandparents, can go talk to grandparents about things where mom and dad's reaction, but grandpa or grandma might give you a different reaction, but you don't go to them with that if you hadn't been down on the ground playing with them and you hadn't had those fun activities.
Right. And a piece of that too. So part of why I'm interested in family systems, but specifically those intergenerational or skip generation relationships, because I think part of that special sauce, so to speak, that makes grandparents and grandchildren bond so well together when the relationship works is this idea of it being bi-directional or reciprocal. And so there's more of a give and take than you're able to have in a parent-child relationship. Where in parent-child relationships, it's more top-down. The parents make the rules, the children follow them. And obviously there's some space for negotiating in that relationship. But the grandparent-grandchild relationship is more wide open, and you can sort of set the rules and the norms together. And that creates this really special dynamic that sort of fuses the bond and creates this expectation that we're equals in this, we're partners, we're buddies, I can trust you, you have my back. And so I think the more you can build that early on and instill that sort of reciprocity in the relationship, like you said, it becomes easier for them to come to you later on and to just continue having that be the norm, which I think is really special to have a trusted non-parental adult. And then hopefully the idea is that when the grandchild is in their 20s and 30s, you then also have a friend as the grandfather. Like when I talk to my grandparents now, it's as friends. We chat like, we just update each other on our lives. We'll ask advice about things. We'll, gossip when appropriate about other family members and things like that. And it's a safe space where I feel like we can do that. And there's a shared bond there, which is really special.
Yeah. And, one of the things too that I think about when you're talking about this is the idea that with grandparents and grandchildren, sometimes when you have that interaction, it's the grandparents going, hey, what do you want to do today? What do you want for breakfast? What do you want for dinner? And, occasionally, probably more with grandfathers, occasionally it's like, we've got some leftover chocolate cake and we're having chocolate cake for breakfast. So I think that part builds into that bidirectional. There's a little bit of, hey, what do you want to do today? As a little kid, being able to go, hey, this is what I want to do, versus mom or dad saying, hey, time to get up, wash your face, get dressed, come down for cereal.
Right. Yeah. I remember some school days, if my parents were out of town for some reason, after we had moved out of my grandparents' house, when I would still get to go stay at their house, it was the best. We would have sleepovers at Mim and Pops' house. That's what I call my paternal grandparents. They're Mim and Pops. And so we would go and have sleepovers there. And my grandfather was always the one who was slipping me some chocolate ice cream or something, after I probably had already brushed my teeth and maybe shouldn't have been eating any more sugar. But that was sort of his role. He was like, this is just going to be between us. But I remember those instances because they were really special.
Did you find out in any of your research differences between the grandparents and grandchildren that didn't live together versus the ones that did? In some circumstances where grandparents are raising a grandchild. Go ahead.
So yeah, for a portion of my sample, they were raised by a grandparent, or lived in a multi-generational household, like what my experience was growing up. And really what I found to be the most important piece there is not necessarily how close you live to them or whether you lived in the same house as them, but really the quality of the relationship set the precedent. So there were some participants in my sample who are adults now who felt really close with their grandparents who lived in a different region of the United States. But because they prioritized the relationship, whether that was through weekly phone calls or really special visits around the holidays, they just felt love from the relationship, more or less, is really the word that sort of everything boiled down to, is this idea of love and care and wanting to build a relationship with the other person. And that was really more important and was a better predictor for essentially how the adult grandchildren were doing and how they felt about their current relationships with their grandparents than how close they lived if they lived in the same home, which I think should be encouraging for a lot of grandparents who may not live down the street from their grandchildren, which is not necessarily realistic in this day and age anyways.
Right. No, those are great points. I enjoy that. Thank you. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, we're getting close to wrapping things up, was there anything that was shocking to you that was just like, wow, I went into this, and we already talked about it. You go in with kind of a certain ideas, and then you want to see what the data shows you. But was there anything in there where you came out of it going, wow, I was not expecting this result?
So something that I probably should have had my eyes a little bit more open to it before going into the research is just the important role that parents play in the grandchild-grandparent relationship. Parents are really tone setters for whether the relationship is successful or not necessarily as fruitful. And so part of that is the idea of access. How often do grandparents and grandchildren get to see each other? when they do see each other, what are the circumstances? Is it happy occasions? Is it not happy occasions? Is it routine? Is it more rare? And so that was a really interesting finding. At the same time, I found that grandparents and even grandfathers, especially, who really put the extra oomph into the relationship, regardless of how often they were able to see or connect with their grandchildren, were still able to sort of permeate that grant or potential parent barrier and build really close relationships. So I don't know about the experience of your listeners with that parent generation, but I think hopefully all you have to do if you're having issues with parents sort of gatekeeping access to grandchildren is hopefully show them some of the research, play them some of these episodes from the Cool Grandpa podcast, just to say, look, this is not only good for our family as a whole, but it's really good for your kids to have these relationships and be able to have connections. So I think there's a way around that. And hopefully not too many of your listeners are having to deal with parent gatekeeping issues. But I know now after doing this research that is absolutely a reality and something that I hope to address in the future, because it seems to be more common of an issue than we would like.
Mm. Yeah,
that's kind of a downer to end the episode.
No, but you're right, because it is, even though we're talking grandparent relationships, the parents are definitely right there in the middle, and they are definitely gatekeepers for that. And so, and we do talk about this, is that it is important to support the parents and to be connected with them. And it's not to manipulate the relationship, but it's to be, hey, the family unit as a whole needs to be functional and healthy if you're going to be able to have the impact with the grandchildren that you hopefully you want to have.
Right. And I think framing it as everyone's on the same team. We all have the same goals. We want to have a strong family. We want to have strong relationships. We want this child or these children to grow up to be happy, healthy, productive members of society. And part of that is having strong relationships with your family. And so I think hopefully that argument can only help conversations there.
Yeah. Abby, is there anything about the research or anything that you want to talk about that I haven't asked you about?
I think we've covered just about anything. It's funny that we got 1 second. His buddy's outside, so he's feeling sad about that.
Oh, sure.
I apologize. But the only thing that I highlighted that we originally touched on is the idea that grandfathers as storytellers, specifically in my work, they were cited as excellent storytellers. So those who were conveying stories from their grandfathers as adults said that their grandfathers, specifically more so than their grandmothers even, had this really special way of talking about both their past, but also their family history more broadly, or just things that were happening in their life. So I think bringing it full circle, storytelling is really important, and hopefully an easy way to start building those connections, to start thinking about ways to convey ideas, values, things that are important to you, to your grandchildren.
Yeah, that's great advice. And it just prompts me again that I've got to find that resource about storytelling and do a little bit more on that. That also, I think, ties in a little bit with something that we talk about too, not to get onto another topic, but the importance of reading to grandchildren and setting that tone of, hey, stories and until they're old enough to understand a story about you being in high school and what you went through. Those early reading stories are important and is a good practice. So, definitely read to your grandkids if you can.
Absolutely.
Abby, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I've really enjoyed this. And one thing before we go, if anybody wanted to reach out to you or connect with you, what's a great way to do that?
Yeah, so my email is atsteph at clemson.edu. I'm currently working as a postdoc at the Institute for Engaged Aging. So that is the best place to reach me if you have any questions about this research. If you Google my name, most of the articles that I've published have popped up. I do have a website, so that should also pop up if you Google me, but it's abigailstephan.com. And I can provide you with all of that, Greg, if you want to link to it somewhere else.
Yeah.
But yeah.
For sure. We'll put that in the show notes so people can get to you if they need to. But thanks again, Abby, for being on here, and I sure do appreciate it.
Thank you.
I really appreciated Abby coming on the Cool Grandpa podcast to talk to us about the research around these intergenerational relationships. There's so much in here that was so interesting to me to find out. And what was also amazing to me is how often what's important for grandmothers is the same thing that's important to grandfathers. Now, there are some differences, just like Abby had pointed out, and some of those differences were that grandmothers felt they were not in contact with their grandchildren enough at about 62%. And then most grandfathers feeling that they had about the right amount of contact with their grandchildren at 53%. It was really interesting to get a hold of some of this. I want to remind you, I've got links to Abby's website, Twitter account, and her Instagram account, as well as I'm going to put her summations in a nice little Word doc that she sent to me. I'm going to put that on a link as well in the show notes. So be sure to check that out. And please check out Abby's website. Check out where she's been talking to different people. And then, follow her on Twitter, follow her on Instagram, and just be connected with her. She's a great, great individual. And like I said, she is my favorite new doctor. So until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.